What is ageism? Ageism is the discrimination based on age, whether that be young towards old or old towards young. And examples of this could be young people submitting to adult authority in schools or other settings, and old people holding back because they think they're too old to do certain things. Being a freshman in high school and coming to Santa Clara, you're definitely treated differently being the young person in a big pool of older people. And whether it's in the classroom or outside of school, you're always kind of aware of your youngness, I guess, and just how a lot of the times your opinions are overlooked just because of your age.
Ageism was coined by Robert N. Butler, a 42-year-old psychiatrist, in 1969. Homeowners in Chevy Chase were distressed by the National Capital Housing Authority's decision to turn apartment complex into public housing, offering residence for elderly poor. Butler witnessed clashes on Chicago streets between age groups. He has this quote that ageism might parallel racism as the greatest issue of the next 20 to 30 years. Negative attitudes towards age and aging have persisted and are deeply rooted in global history. Men and women who were no longer capable of contributing to survival in Neolithic times were cast aside and left to die. Philosopher Seneca said, "Senectus morbidus est," meaning old age is a disease. Ageism can be seen as systematic stereotyping of and discrimination against people because they are old, just as racism and sexism accomplish this with skin, color, and gender. I see ageism manifested in a wide range of phenomena on both individual and institutional levels. Stereotypes and myths, outright disdain and dislike, simple subtle avoidance of contact, and discriminatory practices in housing and employment and services of all kinds.
So I feel like there is this stereotype that needs to be diminished, talking about, the older you get, that technology becomes harder, because technology isn't that, dense to the point where it's, hard for anybody with common sense to be able to work it. So he just talked about that, and just talks about how the younger generation still needs to be nurtured and shown the way, rather than just be given, the keys to a Ferrari and crashing it, basically, which is what they're doing at this point. Is because you see some of these startup companies, like, they don't really last long because they have this idea of how they want to operate, but it rarely goes, to plan. Yeah, it needs to be a good mix of everybody in there, doing their job. I feel like your age shouldn't put a limit on a job you're able to do. I mean, I see if it's physical, but when it's in tech, I feel like your brain works forever until, you get to a certain point. Yeah, right. As long as you stay sharp, it should be fine. Don't let age be a component in, deciding who gets the job, because that just wouldn't make any sense. Because if that's the case, then I know there's some teenagers that are, some of the smartest people in the world. Does that mean they should automatically be head of the company? The smartest shouldn't always have to be the head. Sometimes the smartest should be given the most workload, you know what I'm saying? And the people that know how to manage that workload should be in positions of power. So I just feel like some things just need to be handled. And I know sometimes people may not realize what they're doing, or don't take a minute to stop and evaluate if the way they're going about things are right. But if we just take a step back and just look at facts, or just strictly how we want our company to be ran, there should be a good mix of just race, age wise, everything. There should just be just like our world, there should just be anybody. There shouldn't be any discrimination on any. If you could do the job, you should be able to get the job.
Right. Yeah, definitely agreed. Kind of so I also interviewed two people, both in tech. One was my mentor Chelsea, and then one was my brother Eric. And one of the things that I noticed was, despite how similar they are in age, so like Chelsea's in her mid 20s, and then my brother Eric is like approaching 30. And so despite how similar they are in age, they kind of have very different contexts in which they operate, because Chelsea works primarily with older people. Like, she's in like a well-established like technology enterprise storage company, and then kind of Eric is in the Silicon Valley startup. So he mainly works with like younger people. So their kind of outlooks are a little bit different. And so I guess for Chelsea, she faces ageism on the part of like, older people towards younger people, and like maybe when she goes into like a boardroom or something like that, or like a meeting with like these C-level execs from different companies, she's not quite taken as seriously because of how young she appears, or how young she even is, for that matter. But then for Eric, it's like he's operating in this kind of startup world. Most of them like hire like just college grads most of the time. So he works a lot with like younger people, and so it's kind of this idea of like, the older you get, you have to like be pushed into managerial roles, otherwise you're not advancing in your career, and that can be detrimental to you as you grow older, right? So I think it really depends on, again, this idea of like, in class we talk about positionality and that kind of a thing, and so I think that really plays a role here.
Yeah, and I think that goes to show just how ageism is a two-way street. Like, you can be the oppressor, but you're also in an oppressed group at the same time. Like, they're so similar in age, but they're receiving different kinds of ageism at the same time. But so in my interviews, I found a lot of the same points that KJ did with the technology barrier. So I interviewed my grandpa, and he re-entered the workforce, and he's 76 after retiring, and he found the biggest problem is that technology barrier, just working with people who are so savvy and know all the ins and outs of the technology world, and he's kind of like many steps behind them in that. But an interesting thing that he said was that was the only experience of ageism that he had going back to work. He feels pretty respected by his coworkers, and I think that goes to show just how invisible ageism can be, and how people are kind of accept it, and it's one of the less talked about isms, I think.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I definitely agree with that point. Like, when I had asked, Eric and Chelsea, I was like, oh, hey, have you heard of the term ageism? They were like, no, we'd never heard of the term ageism up until this point. And so it's like a very new kind of idea. But I feel like, the term ageism is like really new, right?
Totally.
It's like I think like since 1969 was when it was like actually a word or anything like that people had started to consider. But I think the idea of ageism has been around for like, since the beginning of mankind, right? Like it's been happening forever. Like, you hear about like, in really old times, like people would just like cast out like people who couldn't contribute to society. Yeah. So, most of the time that would be like sick, or like most of the time elderly people, right? Yeah. So it's like, man, like, it's only taken until now to get to this point, right? Where,
I just think like ageism really, any type of, I guess, social issue that you try to tackle, like, you just see how everything is like a cause and effect, like, okay, you want to have elderly work, but say they can't work, then you have a problem with how are they getting paid, once they retire. You have to work such and such years to get retirement, or even when you do retire, like, do you still feel relevant to society? Do you still feel like you can contribute even though you're not in the workforce? So it's just not one thing to tackle in this ism. I just feel like you have to look at everything that contributes to it. So it's just a hard thing to tackle along with other isms or stuff that you're trying to tackle. I feel like everything ties in together, but trying to find a solution all the way around is just kind of hard, because like you'll never be able to please everyone. It just gets to a point of, all right, how can we make the most impact? and having the most impact, I feel like there will be some drawbacks in other areas, but it's how can we have the most impact with the less, negative coming out of it. So I just feel like, I don't know, is there a real solution, or is this something that is just one of the commodities that come with life,
Right. I think it's hard because like ageism is so like a part of everything, like we're so like ingrained from the very beginning, like childhood, like, like wrinkles are like, right, like in the TED Talk, she's like, oh, wrinkles are ugly, but we're taught that because like the pharmaceutical, or not the pharmaceutical industry, but it's like the skincare industry, says that it is, right, and so you see ads all the time, and so it's definitely hard. It's just like a mindset, I feel like. But yeah, I don't know if there's like a solution where like we'll just end ageism completely. I don't know if that exists, but I do feel like I think the first step that we could do is to like get it out there, like spread awareness about like, hey, this is an actual thing. Right?
Because it's one of those less talked about isms, like I said, and I think the more we talk about it and the more we can try to create an understanding of it, then the less of it we're going to see in society.
Our first proposal is to educate and create awareness. Oftentimes it is assumed that ageism is an ism that has to deal with, quote unquote older people. But the more that you learn and educate yourself on this topic, you learn that you're either oppressed or the oppressor in this ism. But while you are involved, you are both at the same time. The quicker we are able to jump on this topic and educate people, the faster we are able to widen this gap, because I feel like this ism is creating a gap between the generation that doesn't need to be there. I feel like it is becoming more of a nonverbal gap, or just an assumption that, the old go with the old and the young go with the young. Just creating awareness and educating people is our first step to tackling this problem. Our second proposal is to unpack the boxes we put people in based on their age. In layman's terms, that means just stereotyping, and we talked about that in our talk, just basically saying just because a person looks old doesn't mean that they are quote unquote a grandma or a grandpa. We too often prejudge or make assumptions about people based on how they look on the outside, and we never really get to know them as people to start off. And that's a big part of ageism, is just that prejudice and stereotype, is just that once you reach a certain age that everything kind of cuts off for you. When we talk about stereotypes, it's often you could talk about this millennial age where we are kind of seen as this group of whiny people that aren't willing to work hard for what they have. Just on a general basis, making stereotypes about anybody isn't good, one, for your positionality, or two, for this ism that we are talked about. And who are we to assume that the young generation wants to be in technology like we say we are, or how we focusing on? I know many peers that want to do music. I myself want to play basketball. We should be more aware of how we approach people and what we think of people, and always keep an open mind and try to give people a fair chance to show you who they are. Our third proposal is to realize how you want to be treated now and treat younger people that way when you're older. I came into college as a 17-year-old, and I was thrust into the position to need to contribute to the team. Ageism against me was enacted upon because people felt like since I was 17, I just was fresh out of high school, I had nothing to offer, and I wasn't in a position to lead the team. And luckily, I stayed strong and steady and kept my confidence. And over time, I showed that I was fully capable of being a leader, and my age had nothing to do with my abilities. So I feel like if we are able to take one thing away from this, is that ageism works on both sides. But when you're young like this, you realize that you want to be heard and you want to have a voice, and that want and need shouldn't go away or shouldn't be taken less lightly because you grow older or grow out of that phase.